Hi, Math 2. This is Unit 6, Lesson 11 in our workbooks, and I'm on page 86. Unit 6, Lesson 11 is about perpendicular lines. So let's talk about perpendicular lines using this diagram that's on page 86. So for line AB, this line AB, the slope of line AB, let's use this blue slope triangle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and up 2. So we moved a positive 5 units in the x direction, and we moved a positive 2 units up in the y direction. So my slope is equal to my rise or my run. That's my change in y over change in x. So my slope of this line would be 2/5. Let's take a look at this line. The slope of line AB prime. So in this particular line, if I move from A to B prime, I either can think of it as going up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the y direction, which is positive, but going left 2 in the x direction, which is negative. Or I could think about my movement as going positive 2 in the x to get to C prime, but now I have to go down 5 in the y. Either way, when I think of that, my slope is negative 5/2. That would be my rise over my run. So whether you think of it as -5 over +2 or +5 over -2, the point is that slope is negative. This line is decreasing, it's sloped downward. It makes sense it has a negative slope. So let's take a look at our two slopes of our lines. I can tell from the picture where I see my right angle mark that line AB is perpendicular to line AB prime. Remember, this upside down T symbol means perpendicular. It means they meet at a 90-degree angle, a right angle. And their slopes are what we call negative reciprocals or opposite reciprocals. So the slopes of perpendicular lines are opposite reciprocals. Whereas the slopes of parallel lines we learned last week in lesson 10 were the same. So let's take just a quick look at a couple examples. So for example, if I have a line and my slope is 3/4, and I want to talk about the perpendicular slope. So the slope of a line that would be perpendicular. Reciprocal means to flip-flop the 3 and 4, the 3 and the 4, just basically rotating the fraction. So I'm going to turn it. So it would become 4/3. And when we say it's an opposite reciprocal, that means we're also going to change the sign. So the slope of a perpendicular line would be -4/3. Let's take a look at another example. So now if I have the slope was equal to a -5, you can think about this as -5/1 if you want to. So now when I start thinking about what my perpendicular slope would be, I start thinking about flip-flopping them, rotating them. Well, then my 1 comes to the numerator and the 5 goes to the denominator. And when I think about doing opposite reciprocal, then instead of being negative, it becomes the opposite. It becomes positive. So my slope would be +1/5. These are slopes that are opposite reciprocals. And you can see up above, my slope was -5/2 for my line AB prime. My slope was +2/5 for my line AB. Those are opposite reciprocals. So I'm on page 86 of your book. On page 86 at the bottom. So these are extra notes to fit in at the bottom of that page. So we're going to practice finding the slope of each given line. And then we're going to state the slope of a line perpendicular. So we have two things to do for A, B, and C here. One, I have to find the slope. And two, I have to state the slope of a line perpendicular. So first, when I look at A, I want you to note which form it is. This is the slope-intercept form where it's y equals mx plus b that we've been talking about. So I can see my slope. I know the slope of this line is equal to -3/4. So that allows me to think of the slope of any line that would be perpendicular to this one. That's an upside down looking T for perpendicular and M for slope. So my perpendicular slope would be the opposite reciprocal. So we're going to take my 3/4 and we're going to flip it to 4/3 and we're going to think the opposite. So since it was negative, it becomes a positive. So my slope of a line that'd be perpendicular to this one would be 4/3. So let's take a look at 1b. This is in my y minus k equals m times x minus h form. That's my point slope form that we've been talking about in lessons 9 and 10. So I can see my slope. My slope is a +5. So the slope of this line is a +5, or 5/1 if you want to think about it that way. So the slope of any line that's going to be perpendicular is the opposite reciprocal. So if I visualize this as 5/1, then my reciprocal is 1/5, and the opposite of being positive is negative. So the slope of a line perpendicular would be -1/5. So we're now to the third problem C. This problem is in standard form, ax plus by equals c. So I can't see my slope. So this is the type of problem that if I want my slope, I have to solve for y. So I'm not ready to find my slope of that yet. I need to solve for y. So I'm going to start by subtracting 2x from both sides. So I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. And I get -3y equals -2x plus 6. To continue solving for y, I'm now going to divide every single term by 3. And so I get y equals, this is a negative divided by a negative, which is a positive. And I can just write the 2/3 out in front as a coefficient on x. So it's 2/3 x, 2 times x divided by 3. And then a +6 divided by a -3 is a -2. So I can see that my slope for this line is +2/3. So now I'm thinking about the slope of any line that's going to be perpendicular. So a line perpendicular to this one, the slope would have to be the opposite reciprocal. So I'm going to flip my 2 and 3. So I have my 3/2, and it needs to be the opposite sign. So since it was positive, my perpendicular slope then would be negative. So let's take a look at another problem. Please write this one down at the bottom of page 86. Write an equation, sorry about the D, write an equation of a line that passes through this point and is perpendicular to this line. So this is similar to problems we've already done with parallel lines. So you're given this equation to figure out the slope. It's got to be perpendicular to this line. So I've got to first figure out the slope of the line y equals 2x plus 1. Well, this would be a slope of 2. So that's the slope of that line. I'm trying to write an equation of a line perpendicular to it. So I need to come up with its slope, a line perpendicular to it. So I know my perpendicular slope would be the opposite reciprocal. So if this is 2/1, my reciprocal would be 1/2, and the opposite of positive would be negative. So I know the slope of my line that I would like to write the equation for is -1/2. And I know it goes through the point 2,5. So I'm going to use my point slope form. My y minus k equals m times x minus h. When I do that, I get y minus 5 equals -1/2 x minus 2. And that would be the equation of the line they're asking me for. 3a says, what is the slope of the line passing through 1, -2, and 5, 8? So 1, -2, and 5, 8 are 2 points on a line, and I'd like to find the slope of that line. So since I'm not given a graph, I can't use slope triangles, I'm going to use the slope formula. As a reminder, the formula for slope is the difference in my y values over the difference in my x's. And it doesn't matter which y I start with. I could start with the 8 or the -2. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to start with -2 minus 8. But now that I write my denominator, it does matter which x I use first. Since I use the -2 first on top, I'm going to use the 1 first. So this becomes 1 minus 5. This would be -10. When the signs are the same, I add and keep the sign, over -4. This is a negative over a negative, and that's a positive. And then 10 over 4, I can reduce that. They both have a factor of 2. When I reduce 10 by 2, I get 5. And when I divide 4 by 2, I get 2. So it looks like the slope of that line is 5/2. So now it asks, what's the slope of the line perpendicular? Well, I remember that perpendicular slopes are opposite reciprocals. So the perpendicular slope would be the opposite reciprocal. So I would flip the 2 and 5, and it's the opposite sign. It makes it negative. The slope of the line perpendicular would be -2/5. So now flip to page 85. Please write down these 3 problems on page 85 of your book. The first problem says, write the equation of a line parallel to -2/3 x plus 7 going through the point 2, 3. Number 2 says, write the equation of the line perpendicular to y equals -2/3 x plus 7 going through the point 2, 3. Notice that these 2 sentences are the same. However, one asks for the line parallel. That's what we were doing in Unit 6, Lesson 10. And this one asks for the line that would be perpendicular to it. That's what we're doing in Lesson 11. And third, please write the equation of the line perpendicular to y equals 3/4 x plus 7 going through point 0, 0. I would like you to pause the video and use your notes from today and also last week to answer all 3 of these questions and then come back and check your answers. So welcome back. Let's check your answers. My answers are all in red for these 3 problems. So for problem number 1, I used the fact that I remembered parallel lines have the same slope. And so I wrote my point slope, y minus my 3 equals my slope -2/3 times x minus the 2. For question number 2, I use the fact that I've learned today that, well, really we learned this before, but that perpendicular lines have opposite reciprocal slopes. So when I wrote my equation, I did my y minus my 3 equals my perpendicular slope 3/2 times x minus my 2. And finally, in the last problem, I wanted you to see what happens when either my x and or my y is 0. So first of all, my perpendicular slope is -4/3. And either one of these equations are the correct way to write that line. We know that y minus 0 is just y, and x minus 0 is just x. And if you're wondering about this, when you don't have a plus or a minus number at the end, it just means that the y-intercept is the origin. So if I was to graph this line, I know that this is really a plus 0 at the end. So I simply would use my slope, my -4/3. So I could go down 4 because that's negative in the y. But then I'd have to go right 3 because I would want to go positive in the x if I do that. Or I could go +4 in the y. So I'm going to go up a +4, But in order to be negative 4/3 slope, I now would have to go negative in the x direction, which is left. And I would get my line, which would look something like this. And this is the line of y equals negative 4/3 x. And it goes to the origin and has a y-intercept of b.